Order, order. Teresa Pearce to move the motion.
Thank you. I'm honoured to open this debate under your chairmanship, Mrs Mayne. I think it's the first time I've ever opened a debate with you in the chair, so it's very nice to see you there. It's an important topic on the challenges facing the Crown Prosecution Services in light of significant cuts in resources. And the purpose of today's debate is to look at whether the institution is sufficiently supported to carry out its work effectively, or whether the cuts to staff and resources are leading to a permanent decline in its performance. And it's difficult to overstate how important the CPS is to all of us, ensuring that the laws that knit together our complex society are adhered to, and that those who transgress are brought to justice in a timely way and in the best traditions of a free and fair democracy. When asked to name a great British institution, the CPS may not be on the tip of everybody's tongue, but it plays a crucial practical role by bringing to life two of the core rights of every British citizen, the right to a fair trial and the right to get justice as a victim of crime. And it's not a criticism to say that CPS isn't to the forefront of everyone's mind, because in some ways it's a measure of their success that when they're doing the job well, they don't garner much attention. But it's when things go wrong that the organisation is scrutinised with the brightest of public spotlights, which has happened this year. Across the press, from the Daily Telegraph to the Plymouth Herald, there have been headlines such as cuts plunge CPS into crisis, shocking and unforgivable court delays cause more crime, and indeed today the Justice Secretary has added his own voice. And there is no doubt that there are many talented, dedicated staff who make sure that the CPS does all it can to fulfil its obligations to society and to safeguard the core rights of every British citizen. But serious concerns have been raised as to whether the CPS, which is a demand-led service, is being sufficiently resourced to deal with the spike in historic sex offences, child abuse cases, and those cases arising out of an increasing and complex terror threat. And in these circumstances, does it seem right that the CPS has seen a 28.3% cut to its budget, which is estimated to be around £200 million per annum since 2010? And does it seem right that the most vulnerable participants in the criminal justice system, the victims and the witnesses, are being detrimentally affected because of these cuts? There is a legal and a moral obligation on the CPS to serve the needs of every single victim. I'm proud that my party has been in the forefront of improving the position of victims within the criminal justice system, establishing the Victims Task Force. The task force comprises leading criminal justice specialists and campaigners who lead work on establishing a victims' law and advise on further improvements on the way victims and witnesses are treated by the criminal justice system. And it's not rocket science to know that delays in case progression puts increased pressure and strain on victims and witnesses, leading to many facing prolonged periods in limbo and not knowing where the cases stand and unable to move on with their lives.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will.
Thank you. Does my honourable friend agree that... pardon? Sorry. Oh, sorry. Does my honourable friend agree that not only are there issues with the cuts to CPS in progressing cases and in arming prosecutors with the correct information in court, but it's actually increasing the number of diversions from courts, which is obviously having a negative impact on victims and witnesses as well?
Thank you for the intervention. Yes, I totally agree. It's a very, very stressful time for people, and the delays just make it more so. So I totally agree. I'd like to say a few words about the current experiences of witnesses in criminal proceedings, and although I anticipate others may also mention this, there is an ongoing and widening gulf between the ideal world of a system which should be supporting victims and witnesses and the real-world experience which so frequently fails them. There was an editorial in The Independent last year which said, "Procedures are designed with little consideration of the needs of victims and witnesses in whose interests they are supposedly working. And anyone who's attended court, as I have as a witness in a criminal case, knows how difficult it is to understand court scheduling, and you may mentally prepare all day for an appearance that doesn't happen, and then it's announced it's adjourned to another time, and decisions are rarely explained or laid out. And sometimes it's even more difficult. In my particular case, I was witness to a very violent crime outside my house, and it was arranged that I would be able to give evidence behind a screen so that I couldn't be identified. But then when I got to court, they put me in the waiting room with the accused family, which actually meant that the whole thing was absolutely terrifying. Clearly, if courts were private businesses, witnesses are customers of court proceedings, and they will be well within their rights to complain about the service they receive. And the Ministry of Justice agrees with this itself. It admitted, for victims and witnesses, the criminal justice system can be baffling and frustrating, and their experience all too often falls below the standards which one might expect from a modern public service. And staff cuts have hit hard. Between 2010 and 2013, the number of witness care managers whose job it is to aid victims and witnesses fell by 43%. The witness care managers provide services that are little known to the public, especially compared with the police and the CPS, and at the current rate of cutting, it is a real concern whether they will even exist going forward. In my own area, my constituency falls partly within the London Borough of Bexley, the Magistrates' Court Observers Panel operates. And they've suggested if the public was more aware of witness care managers, it would encourage more victims to come forward and report crimes, especially in cases of domestic violence, hate crime and sexual assault, because it may give them confidence that they need to pursue a complaint. The Magistrates' Court Observers Panel have singled out their concerns, particularly for domestic violence cases, and the fact that a high number of complainants withdraw their statements or fail to attend the trial. Their most recent report states that across all prosecutions they looked at, in over 65% of trials where the CPS offered no evidence, it was because the complainant or the witness had withdrawn or failed to attend court. Learning from this, I understand that a separate team has now been set up to deal with domestic violence cases. I think this is an intelligent move, and hopefully it will allow skilled professionals to prepare cases in a thoughtful way and give the support required to move matters forward. I will.
To the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I congratulate her on securing this debate, and I agree with her certainly that we need to put victims of crime at the very centre of the criminal justice system and the work that is carried out. I've worked at Bexley Magistrates Court that the Honourable Lady alluded to, and would she welcome the work of the Witness Support Service there that has over many years now actually assisted both prosecution and defence witnesses when they're attending a court? And would she also...
Remind the honourable gentleman, interventions are usually brief and of the singular nature.
Thank you.
I shall call Teresa Pearce.
Thank you for the intervention. Yes, I would welcome their work. They do a fantastic job at Bexley Magistrates Court, and often when people are considering coming forward as a witness or reporting a crime, they're not aware that that support will be there, and I think we need to do more to publicise it. So it's a very, very important job that they do. Because being a witness in a criminal proceeding is hard enough. The pressures of enduring cross-examination, being with barristers, the alien environment of a sterile courtroom is all enough to make a witness feel massively intimidated. But sometimes getting even basic support from a witness care manager can be all the difference between a difficult time and an absolutely impossible ordeal. So I'd like to ask the Minister, in light of the reduction of nearly 43% in witness care manager numbers, what is the Minister going to do to safeguard the right of every witness to be supported? If witnesses continue to be unsupported, they are less likely to come forward in the first place, they are less likely to actually turn up at court, and less likely to give good evidence when cross-examined, and less likely to look back on the experience as anything but a really demoralising experience. So the cost of rescheduling hearings, postponing trials and abandoning prosecutions midway through will surely outweigh any savings made through cuts. I think this is an area where we could actually spend to save. Because cuts to these witness care managers is a false economy of the worst kind. And I wanted to just say a few words about a special category of crime which the CPS prosecutes, which is the historical sexual abuse cases, which is a real special category of crime, and perhaps there are a few more compelling examples of witnesses needing support than these cases. If we fail the victims in these cases, then we really must look again at the logic of making CPS budget cuts. Historical sexual abuse is a crime which is regrettably coming to define our time. It represents a moral stain on society's character. The late Lord Bingham, a former senior law lord, was right to hold up what he called equality before the law as a cornerstone of our society. Too often victims of crime which took place sometimes decades ago have felt that they'd been treated unequally and ignored by society and ignored by our criminal justice system. We as legislators cannot undo the terrible things that victims have had to endure, but we can strive to make sure that there is justice for them. We can try very hard to address their concerns and their years of not being listened to. And the way we do this is by properly funding the CPS in these cases. The Director of Public Prosecutions has requested that the Chancellor provide 50 million worth of funding to effectively prosecute cases of historical sex abuse. So I'd ask the Minister to commit to doing everything possible to provide the funding requested for these cases and to make sure that the victims are taken full care of while undergoing such an ordeal. It's clear that the CPS is a demand-led service and cannot function appropriately if it's not adequately resourced. The opposing forces of increasing crime and decreasing funding means the system is struggling to cope. And the rise in the number of terror suspects being investigated is a further burden being put on the service. Alison Saunders, the Director of Public Prosecutions, has been forced to consider doubling the number of prosecutors to cope with the magnitude of the challenge with complex terrorist-related suspects. And due to the complex nature of these offences, it means much more time and resources had to be put into preparing these cases. And it's imperative that we reflect on what the CPS does well and what it is failing to do as a result of these cuts. But what we must ask ourselves is how can we possibly expect the service during a time of austerity and budget cuts of 28% to rise to these increasing challenges? It'd be wrong to blame the CPS solely for this. Sometimes there's poor casework preparation and there's delays, which are not always their fault. But with staff cuts and growing workloads, administrative errors are more likely and increasingly cases are being dropped because of unnecessary mistakes. The CPS is trying to modernise. It's pursuing digital working, moving from a paper-based system to a digital one. If that is successful, it stands to save taxpayers' money in the future. But however, there has been huge criticisms of that service, and I think it needs to be reviewed to make sure that it really is providing value for money, because expensive mistakes must be avoided. We as a society depend on the CPS to bring justice to those who cannot or will not observe the laws that we make for ourselves. So I will ask the Minister, will the Minister undertake to look again at where the CPS cuts are falling, not least to make sure that the savings being made aren't outweighed by money lost because of delays and lack of witness support? Thank you.
Could I ask that the member moves the motion? I think the wording will be given to her.
Sorry?
If she looks at the note that's just been passed to her,
right.
might be helpful. We have new proceedings, so we're all learning.
Would you please move it? Oh, right. I would like to move the motion. I beg to move that this House considers the work of the Crown Prosecution Service. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for that. So I shall now call Simon Danchuk.
Thank you, Mrs Mayne, and let me thank my honourable friend for Erith and Thamesmead for securing this debate. It's a debate that certainly needed to be had. My involvement with the Crown Prosecution Service in recent years has mainly focused on the failure to prosecute child sexual abusers. We know that in the 60s, 70s and indeed the 80s, people like Cyril Smith and Victor Montague were allowed to continue to abuse children because the CPS were unable or unwilling to bring cases against them, even when they had the evidence. It's a legacy that should shame the CPS and the entire justice system. But these failures are not just a thing of the past. The case of Lord Janner is an interesting case study into the workings of the modern-day CPS and their attitude towards alleged child abusers. We know that the CPS failed to press for prosecution of Lord Janner in 1991, in 2002 and indeed in 2006. And the current Director of Public Prosecutions, Alison Saunders, has admitted that he should have been prosecuted. Now we hear that he cannot face justice because he is too ill. Before discussing the case in detail, I want to make the point that we cannot underestimate the effect that failed prosecutions have on the survivors of abuse. There are many people...
Could I just caution the Honourable Member about discussing the case in particular of Lord Janner in detail rather than discussing the process of the Crown Prosecution Service? I'm sure he will stay completely within order, but I'm just very, very careful that he discusses the Crown Prosecution Service and its relationship to the case rather than the case itself against Lord Janner.
Okay. I understand that.
That's on advice from the clerks.
I understand that, Mrs Mayne, though there's no case against Lord Janner.
No, it's not sub judice. There's no case against Lord Janner, but it is a long-established practice of the House not to criticise members of the other House except on substantive motion. So I'll just let the honourable member carry on, and if he doesn't mind, I'll jump in.
Okay. If
we think he's going off-piste, so to speak.
Thank you, Mrs. Mann. I always appreciate your guidance in these matters. I was making the point that the failure of the CPS to prosecute cases can have a real impact and can be extremely damaging. Research shows that child sexual abuse victims die on average 20 years early. They may commit suicide, they may become alcoholic or drug dependent. They may just struggle to cope with life because of what has been done to them by their abusers. What we do know is that abuse victims die in their 30s, 40s or 50s, whilst their abusers live into their 70s or 80s. This kind of failing by the CPS also reduces the public's faith in the justice system. It discourages people from reporting child sexual abuse because they think the CPS will say that the victims are unreliable, it is not in the public interest, or, in the case of Lord Janner, that the alleged perpetrator is too ill. Perhaps most importantly, failure by the CPS actually emboldens the perpetrators of child abuse. When the CPS failed to prosecute Cyril Smith in the 1960s, he went on to abuse for decades. And when the CPS failed to prosecute the Rochdale grooming gang in the early 2000s, they carried on raping girl A for years afterwards. Poor white working class boys considered unreliable witnesses in the 1960s in relation to Cyril Smith. Fast forward, poor white working class girls considered unreliable witnesses in the 2000s. Returning to the case of Lord Janner, the shocking thing is that the CPS admits that the witnesses are not unreliable. It admits that Janner should face prosecution, but refuses to bring a case. I know the police are furious about this, and rightly so. Anyone who has heard the accusations will be similarly outraged. I've met with Leicestershire Police and discussed the allegations in some detail. Children being violated, raped and tortured, some in the very building in which we now sit. The official charges are 14 indecent assaults of a male under 16 between 1969 and 1988, 2 indecent assaults between 84 and 88, 4 counts of buggery of a male under 16 between 72 and 87, 2 counts of buggery between 1977 and 1988. My office has spoken to a number of the alleged victims and heard their stories. I cannot overstate the effect that this abuse has had on their lives. So to sum up my speech, I want to make the following points about the case. If Lord Janner really is too ill to face prosecution, then why can't the courts establish this with a fitness to plead process? This would clear up doubts that still linger, for example, why he was still visiting Parliament on official visits after he was declared unfit to face justice. Why is he able to contribute to the law-making process in the House of Lords, but unable to face the law himself? If it is found that he is genuinely too ill to stand trial, then why not conduct a trial of the facts? This would allow the victims to tell their stories and gain some sense of justice. The DPP has said that a trial of the facts would not be in the public interest. Personally, I fail to see how the knowledge that a peer of the realm is a serial child abuser is not in the public interest. Let me finish.
Question the honourable gentleman about alleging anything against Lord Janner, yes. Assertions about his guilt or innocence.
Yeah. Thank you, Mrs. Mann. I appreciate that. Let me finish by saying this. The Director of Public Prosecutions has said that Lord Janner will not offend again. But, Mrs. Mann, the failure to prosecute Lord Janner offends every principle of justice. He may not abuse again, but the legacy of the abuse continues. His victims need the truth and they need to be heard. Thank you very much, Mrs. Mann.
I call Christina Rees.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mrs. Mayne, and I congratulate the honourable member for securing this debate. Since Neath Magistrates Court closed last year, my constituents have to travel to Swansea, over 20 miles away, denying them access to local justice. in their own community and putting an added strain on the Crown Prosecution Service. Constituents and local solicitors have told me that the closure of the local court has had a negative impact locally. Those on low incomes may have to choose between buying everyday necessities or the cost of travelling to court, causing them hardship at an already stressful time. The closure has caused great inconvenience to those in Neath who have to attend court as the victims of what may be spurious allegations or charges, or to find their case adjourned. The cuts in legal aid and the two-tier criminal justice contract has left constituents without legal aid representation. When residents of Neath are arrested, they are taken to Bridewell Custody Suite in Bridgend, over 20 miles away, and when they are released, have no way of getting home. Constituents and the local solicitors have told me that policing has declined in Neath since the closure of the court. Therefore, the reorganisation of courts has not worked for Neath. The further announcement today by the Justice Secretary of more reorganisation is alarming, and I urge the Government to consider these proposals very carefully. Thank you.
I call Nick Thomas-Simons.
Thank you very much, Mrs Main. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I also congratulate and thank the Honourable Member for Erith and Thamesmead for securing this very important debate today. It's over 10 years since I first picked up the files from the Crown Prosecution Service to prosecute what was known as the Magistrates' List when I was a young pupil barrister. Now, much has changed at the Crown Prosecution Service since then. I still had to handwrite the results of every single case on the outside of each of the white files. Now, technology has brought us to an online system, and of course the criminal procedure rules have streamlined the system too. What I would say to the Solicitor General is that what streamlining and management changes cannot do is take human judgment out of the system. The reality is that decisions within the Crown Prosecution Service have to be taken by individual lawyers. I welcome, of course, the role of CPS Direct at a very early stage and at the charging stage, though I would perhaps gently suggest to the Solicitor General that there could be a little bit more clarity throughout the system as to when police actually have to take advice from CPS Direct, particularly in cases where there is a very, very clear lack of evidence, which would, of course, render that step unnecessary. However, crucial to CPS Direct working well as part of the system is both the availability of lawyers and the fact that there shouldn't be excessive delays at that early stage. But of course, the charging decision itself is a matter of judgment. The two-stage test, and of course the Solicitor General, having practiced criminal law for so many years in Cardiff, will be only too aware of this fact. Both the evidential test of a realistic prospect of conviction and then, of course, the public interest test mean that human beings have to actually exercise that judgment. The fewer people that you have doing that and the longer hours that those people left have to actually exercising that judgment will surely inevitably mean that errors will become more commonplace, and that will show in the statistics when one looks at the performance of the Crown Prosecution Service. In addition to that, it is absolutely critical that Crown Prosecution Service lawyers have the time and space to prepare trials properly. Take, for example, watching CCTV, watching a DVD, listening to audio evidence. Those things take time, and that time has to be built into the system, because if it isn't, it will simply lead to delays further down the line. I would also add that the position of complainants and witnesses is absolutely critical in this, as is transparency in the work of the Crown Prosecution Service. I welcome what the Director of Public Prosecutions has said in relation to the recent consultation on greater help for supporting witnesses at court, and I hope that will lead to a very strong Crown Prosecution Service policy on pre-trial assistance. Because there is, Mrs Main, no conflict, in my view, between robust cross-examination on the part of a solicitor or barrister at court, on the one hand, and ensuring that witnesses and complainants are fully supported and are familiar with the environment in which they are to enter. I certainly do praise the work of victim support. I also praise the victim's right to review, particularly in situations where there's been a decision not to charge, to discontinue or withdraw in the case of the magistrates, to offer no evidence, or indeed to leave charges on file. But we do not serve victims, complainants or witnesses well if the Crown Prosecution Service is inefficient, under-resourced and understaffed. And that will have a knock-on effect throughout the criminal justice system. Things such as delays at court, poorly prepared trials, suboptimal charging decisions and problems in cases at a very late stage. They all fail witnesses and victims, and they undermine public confidence in the criminal justice system as a whole. And what I would urge the government to do is not to wield the axe indiscriminately at the Crown Prosecution Service budget without considering very carefully what the knock-on effects would be and what the overall effect would be of corrosive effect, rather, on the system as a whole.
Kyle, Mr. Mike Weir.
Thanks, Mrs. Main. I'm pleased to be able to make a short contribution to this debate on the Crown Prosecution Service. Prior to being elected to this House, I was a solicitor in private practice for some 20 years and spent many happy hours in courtrooms defending clients. In Scotland, however, we have always had an independent prosecution system, unlike in England. I was interested in what the Honourable Member for Rochdale was saying, and I think he made some very powerful points in relation to child abuse. But my understanding is the CPS only came into being in 1984, and some of the earlier decisions were police decisions rather than CPS decisions. And it may be a bit unfair to blame the CPS for all the problems, but undoubtedly the collapse of some high-profile trials recently has done nothing for the CPS and has led to some of the criticisms being made against them. And I was very interested in what the Honourable Lady for Erith and Thamesmead said in regard to people appearing in court. As I said, I was a solicitor and I was often cross-examining witnesses. But I too found myself as a witness in a case once. And I found that a terrifying experience, I have to say. And after that, I took a much more sympathetic attitude to witnesses, because it is very, very difficult for a witness, even in a relatively simple case, to go to court. Even someone like me who was used to the court system found it difficult to do that. And when you've spent years saying to someone, well, are you sure that's what happened 6 months ago? When you're asked it, you decide how difficult it is to remember these things. And that is an argument, I think, for getting cases to court more quickly. And I noticed it's an interesting day for her to be bringing this debate, since I was in the tea room at lunchtime and I happened to read The Independent with the headline, Crusading Gove Slams Justice for the Wealthy, in which the current Justice Secretary is speaking today, I believe, on the court system and promising rapid and radical reform to the criminal justice through the greater use of technology to accelerate prosecutions and make it less traumatic for witnesses to appear in court. He calls the current system creaking and outdated. And that's interesting because I think that chimes, I think, very much with what she's saying, but how that is going to happen in an era of cuts to the CPS is an interesting balance that it'd be interesting to hear what the Minister has to say about that. But often when we're dealing with cases, in whatever system we are dealing with, one of the biggest problems is when people don't turn up in court. I often had the experience where I turn up in court ready to do a case and perhaps the accused or a witness didn't turn up and the whole thing collapsed. That, again, is very difficult for those witnesses who have turned up, who have often screwed up their courage to come along and do this and find they're sent away and told to come back another day at some indeterminate time in the future. And I think that we have in Scotland tried various things, such as intermediate diets and pleading diets, to try and avoid that happening. But it still happens in cases, and there's always a problem with human nature in these things. And victim support, I'm not sure how it works in England, but certainly in Scottish courts, Victim Support Scotland do excellent work in dealing with the victims of crime who are coming to court, and often also with the witnesses who are coming to give evidence as to what has happened in it. So I think their role should not go unnoticed. There are differences in the English and Scottish systems. As I say, we have always had an independent system through procurators, fiscal and advocates depute, who are independent, always been independent of the police and government, and make decisions on whether to prosecute or not, and the conducts of both cases. Though in both systems, obviously, the police are the primary investigatory body for obvious reasons. One crucial difference between the two systems, however, is the role of barristers, as advocates, we would say, as Scotland. Under the Scottish system, all procurators, fiscal and advocates depute are full-time prosecutors. Whilst, as I understand the way the CPS works, they almost work as a client and engage barristers for particular cases who can be prosecuting one week and defending another, which seems slightly odd to us. We, as I say, our prosecutors are full-time prosecutors, and that is what they do. I'm sure barristers can, and many of them will do very well, compartmentalise their day-to-day cases, but it does seem a curious way to go about things. Dave.
I'm grateful for him for giving way, but does he not accept that's the special thing about the criminal bar? Independence. You may well be prosecuting on one day and defending on the next. It allows for impartiality.
Well, I am not questioning the impartiality, but it does seem, as I say, we have a system with professional prosecutors. I mean, people can go from an advocate depute to be a defending solicitor, but they would leave the Crown Office to do that. They wouldn't do it at the same time, and they would build up an expertise in the prosecution. It's a personal opinion. The Honourable Gentleman, I know, is a long-time practitioner, and I'm sure he has a different view. But I'm just putting forward a view that I would have on that. Obviously, the Honourable Member for Erith and Thamesmead also mentioned the question of cuts within the service, and that is obviously a concern in many areas. In Scotland, again, we have a slightly different system in that the Lord Advocate, who heads the Crown Office, negotiates his own funding deal directly with the Deputy First Minister, who also happens to be the Finance Minister, separate from the wider budget debate. Now, whilst it is also true that the Scottish system has had a budget that is largely flat in cash terms, which is a reduction in real terms over the last few years, in the current year there has been a real terms increase, and I think that is in recognition of some of the problems there have been in the court system. The Honourable Lady from Neath made very good points about the access to justice locally, and that is an issue that we have also struggled with in many areas of Scotland. And I think when we're talking about the rationalisation, the new technology of services, that also brings in an issue there. Because we have in my constituency, when I practiced, there was 2 sheriff courts, which are the equivalent of English magistrates' courts, but they have now been, one of them has now been closed down and transferred to one. But what they have done is put a lot more investment into that court, and particular investment into technology such as video technology, so witnesses can give video evidence, and there is the facility for children to give evidence over video links. I'm sure much of that happens in English courts, but it does need investment. And I think what is interesting about what the Justice Secretary has been saying today is the greater use of technology does indeed, again, mean investment. And I question how much that would be able to do in an area where cuts are being made. And again, the Honourable Member for Torfeen gave a very good exposition of his own experience in the prosecution service, and you know, I don't have that experience, but I understand what he was saying. I think the CPS is a good service, and the principle of an independent prosecution service is very important. I think it is unfortunate that in some ways it has got a bad reputation in recent years because of some of the high-profile cases that have not gone well when it went to trial, or the trials have collapsed early. But I think in any justice system, as rightly was said at the outset, it is about making sure everyone has a fair trial and witnesses are properly dealt with when they come to trial. So it does need investment, and we make cuts in such systems at our peril.
I call Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mrs Main, and can I too congratulate my honourable friend for securing this important debate. I immediately declare an interest. I was the Director of Public Prosecutions and Head of the Crown Prosecution Service from 2008 to 2013, and the current DPP was Head of London as one of my staff and is known to me. So that's my declaration of interest. The CPS is, of course, a demand-led organisation which has taken significant cuts in recent years. And as a result, it has significantly fewer staff, as a result, less resilience, and faces probably greater challenge now than it's faced for many years. And I'd like to start by paying tribute to the staff who work in that environment, delivering the best they can in those circumstances. One of the unknowns for a demand-led organisation like the Crown Prosecution Service is the caseload. And undoubtedly, in the years that I was DPP, the caseload, the number of cases coming into the CPS from the police, reduced. And that significantly softened the impact of some of the cuts. The difficulty, as I see it, and the risk that the CPS was running when I was DPP was that the reason for the reduction was never properly understood. And nobody could explain why the numbers were going down. And equally, nobody could properly predict when the numbers were going to twist and go up. And I note the reports recently of increased numbers of sexual abuse cases coming into the CPS, which are, of course, intensely resource intensive. The cuts to the CPS are not dissimilar to cuts to other parts of the criminal justice system or to cuts to parts of the civil justice system. And as the Solicitor General will know, there were a series of very critical reports in relation to the civil side recently, in this House and elsewhere, which were really indicating that the strategy of the last 5 years has been to cut first and look at the evidence and the impact later, rather than the other way round. And that's a very serious criticism of any strategy. And one of my concerns has been whether there has truly been a criminal justice strategy in the last 5 years that goes beyond taking the money out in terms of focusing on what the actual service is to be delivered. Now, against that background and recognising what Sir Brian Leveson said in his recent report on the efficiency of the court, namely that there is an irreducible core minimum in funding below which you can't deliver the service, can I just raise this issue, which really, for the Solicitor General, which is what arrangements are currently in place to ensure that the government has a line of sight on the risks being run by reducing resources to the CPS? Have there been impact assessments recently, evidence-based impact assessments, as to the impact of those reduced resources? And if so, can some or all of those impact assessments be published? And if, as the Lord Chancellor indicated this morning, the rights of victims are going to be taken more seriously in future, are there currently plans to increase the resource to the CPS to deal more effectively with victims going forward? Can I just finish by making two observations? Of course.
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way and welcoming him to the House? His expertise is widely welcome here. And also to thank my honourable friend for bringing this debate. He mentioned the staff. Does he not agree with me that it's totally unacceptable that the staff have to work unpaid for weekends and with an increasing workload?
Thank you very much for that intervention. And there is, of course, concern about the workload of the staff in the CPS. One of the effects of reduced resources is that the staff have to work much harder in different circumstances and different times. And that is really part of the risk that is run when you reduce the resource to any organisation. It doesn't mean that one must also always return to the status quo and there can't be change. But it really highlights my point. There needs to be a constant risk assessment when resources are reduced in the way they've been reduced. Of course.
Thank you, Mrs. Main. It's simply this. Does the honourable gentleman agree? I should declare an interest as somebody who's been a practising barrister, probably instructed by you, in fact. But does the honourable gentleman agree that when it comes to helping victims and witnesses, that sometimes culture is as important as cost? And so that even during his tenure, there's been an extraordinary change in the way that victims and witnesses are treated. Everything from victim impact statements to screens under the Youth Justice Criminal Evidence Act 1999 to getting counsel to go and meet witnesses before they give evidence, that is actually critically important to giving witnesses a good court experience.
I accept that, and I've always said that you need resource to provide for victims properly, but you also need a culture change. And I share the concerns that my honourable friend raised about Cyril Smith and some of those aged cases. For the record, of course, Cyril Smith was not considered by the Crown Prosecution Service because the Crown Prosecution Service wasn't in existence at the time of those decisions, but it was considered by the DPP at the time, and I've gone on record expressing my concern about the decisions that were made. But it is about a cultural change, and one of the things I was very concerned about when I was DPP was that in relation to some of the sexual grooming cases, there was a cultural inhibition on prosecuting, and that was most acute, I think, in the Rochdale cases. And a new approach was heralded to the prosecution of those cases. So I accept that when it comes to victims, it's not just resource, it is a culture change. I think that culture is changing. It needs to be pressed harder, and it needs to be pressed in other parts of the criminal justice system, but there has been good work. But if we're to take victims more seriously, it does require more resource. And it does require us to be very clear about the risks that are being taken if money is taken out or further money is taken out of the criminal justice system. Can I just finish by observing in relation to the Jana case that the decision before the DPP was not an easy decision. It was a stark and difficult choice between two unattractive approaches. The DPP has followed the victim right of review policy and put that decision out for a review, and I think we should respect the independence she brought to the decision-making and the fact that she's had the courage to put that decision out for a review, and to that extent I think we should inhibit our comments on the case. Thank you.
Turner.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Main. It's a pleasure, as always, to serve under your chairmanship. I suspect, Mrs. Main, that I'm going to be rudely interrupted any moment because we are expecting a division in the main chamber. Can I begin, though, by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Erith and Thamesmead, for securing this very, very important debate. The CPS is going through profound changes, and it's right that we carefully consider the consequences of budget cuts and stretched resources in this demand-led service. The CPS has a vital role to play in the criminal justice system, and it has been well led in recent years, not least, of course, by my honourable and learned friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, but also recently by the current Director of Public Prosecution, Alison Saunders. I've met her on a number of occasions to discuss the challenges that the service faces, and I can say that I believe very firmly to be doing an excellent job in what is an extremely difficult situation. Since 2010, we've seen cuts to the CPS budget of more than 28%, which has led to office closures, reductions in staff, including, I think the figures that I have are 571 prosecutors and 500 administrative staff. Those numbers, Mrs. Main, are absolutely massive when you consider the size of the CPS as it previously existed and the amount of staff that have left as a result of the cuts to that service. This is unprecedented in terms of cuts in resources, and I think it's left, it has to be said, a very big gaping hole in the Crown Prosecution Service. Savage cuts are being made against a backdrop of historical sexual abuse cases, increases in reported child abuse, and complex cases involving terrorist offences. The CPS must be afforded the flexibility to respond to complex cases when the need arises. We've seen in the last couple of years the unprecedented and unexpected rise in the amount of historical sexual abuse cases, and with it the strain that the CPS has been put under as a consequence. The Director has been on bended knee in recent weeks and months, pleading with the Chancellor through the Attorney for £50 million of emergency funding to properly prosecute the high level of historic sexual abuse cases. I'm afraid the Chancellor is yet to award this and will no doubt expect the CPS to shoulder more cuts in the forthcoming budget. Mrs May, that is, in my respectful view, a huge mistake, and if the Chancellor and the Government indeed decide to continue down this path, the problems in the CPS that already exist will be bound to get worse. We all agree that the criminal justice system, including the CPS, needs some reform to be fit for purpose and for the 21st century. And it needs to meet the complexities and challenges of modern demands. But simply slashing the budget and hoping for the best is, in my view, wrong and a very dangerous position to take. We've seen just today, Mrs May, the Justice Secretary come to the sudden realisation that the justice system is in disarray. He's right that victims and witnesses are adversely affected by the inefficiencies and bureaucracy within the criminal justice system. And we welcome on this side of the House is warm words, but need to see the colour of the Chancellor's money, Mrs May. Victims and witnesses are often an afterthought, and we need to see them front and centre in any reforms to the CPS and to the criminal justice system. The Lord Chancellor is right to point out that there are two nations in the justice system at the present time. He shouldn't be surprised, though, it was his government, I'm afraid to say, that introduced savage cuts without thinking them through. And it's right, before I'm interjected on by colleagues on the other side of the House, that yes, it's true, any government coming into power in 2010 would have made cuts, but the reality is, in my view, we would have thought very carefully about where the axe should fall. I think the two previous Lord Chancellors didn't think those cuts through very well at all. We've seen our move towards CPS, the CPS direct model is taking CPS prosecutors away from local offices and police stations. I think that's probably led to a slowdown in charging decisions. The timeliness of charging decisions, of course, has become a real issue. And there have been reports of police officers, waiting to get through to CPS Direct for hours on end. Every area visited in the recent joint inspection of the provision of charging decisions has serious concerns about the mechanism used in charging. Worryingly, the report found serious failings in the timeliness of charging decisions, with 2/3 of calls made to CPS Direct not being answered within its target of 3 minutes. Once officers actually manage to make it through to a prosecutor, they're then taken through a very long process, which often takes over an hour. Mrs May, cuts to the CPS have not been cost effective, as the former HM Chief Inspector of the CPS, Michael Fuller, concluded in his report published on the 15th of March this year. The vast reductions in the workforce has meant that the CPS is unable to deliver value for money advocacy, and the service has made poor progress in most areas. Of course.
Say that actually by 2013 the Crown Prosecution Service, not least because of the intervention of my honourable friend, was left in a better state than it was in 2008 when he took over, and certainly since 2010. And it's simply crude to suggest that actually it's all got worse since 2010. It's simply not the case.
Well, I'm bound to say I disagree. I'm sure that there was vast improvements made by my honourable and learned friend when he was at the helm of the CPS. I remember Mrs. Main cross-examining my learned friend when I was serving, I think, on the Justice Committee, and he made very well the points that the service and the Solicitor General from a secretary position interjects and says he was there as well. I remember him being there, and it's right that improvements were made, but the reality is this: look, we can't pretend that when the Crown Prosecution Service is receiving a 28% cut, without having considered, without having reviewed the entire criminal justice system, I think problems will materialise. And I think when it comes to victims of serious crime, historic sexual offences, we need
There's
to...
a division in the House. I'm sorry to interrupt the Honourable Gentleman.
Thank you.
We've resumed 15 minutes. call Mr. Carl-Turner.
Before the division, the honourable gentleman who unfortunately hasn't made it back yet to his place was making the point, I think, that my honourable and learned friend had improved the CPS as his time as the Director of Public Prosecution. Of course, I agree entirely with that. But the vast reductions in workforce has meant that the CPS has been unable to deliver value for money advocacy, a point which I made briefly. And these are not my words, Mrs. Main. This is the experiences of users of the service are telling us. Victims and witnesses are saying there is a really definite problem. And that, of course, point was made by the HM Chief Inspector of the CPS. There have been reports of CPS advocates turning up for trial without being properly prepared, in some cases not having read the case at all, not having sufficient evidence or even witnesses not warned to attend court. This is not in-house necessarily, in-house solicitors and barristers of the CPS. This is the independent bar as well. Research by HM Inspectorate of the Constabulary have recently reported a postcode lottery effect, Mrs. Main. It's troubling. In some areas of the country, prosecutors have taken forward only 1/3 of cases, whilst in others, like my own area of Humberside, this figure was closer to 9 out of 10 cases, 88%. Victims are being failed by a system that is obviously not coping. People should not be denied justice based on the area that they report the alleged offence in. Confidence, I'm afraid to say, Mrs. Main, in the criminal justice system is essential, and I'm afraid it's not proving to work. Victims must be able to come forward and report crimes with the confidence that the justice system will work for them. In London, Dame Alish Angelini's QC's review into investigations and prosecutions of rape found there to be a serious deficiencies in the criminal justice system in dealing with the number of rape allegations. Since 2005, there's been a 68% rise in recorded sexual offences, but only a 17% increase in charges. Last week, a report by the NSPCC shows a dramatic rise in the number of reported cases of child abuse, with figures rising by 39%. Also, very worryingly, there is a distinct increase in terrorist-related prosecutions, with the DPP projecting the number could top a frightening 600 this year alone. The solicitor will appreciate from his career, very eminent career as I understand it, at the criminal bar, and indeed from sitting as a recorder of the Crown Court, that cases are very often unresolved in these instances, leading to a necessary trial, meaning that more time and resources are needed to prepare the case, with the effect that other cases fall by the way. Alongside cuts to advocates, administrators and office closures, there's been a massive cull in the number of witness care officers, a point made by my honourable friend, the member for Erith and Thamesmead. Almost half of those employed in ensuring that victims and witnesses are dealt with in an appropriate way have gone. Just gone. Been axed. With increased pressure on resources, there are real concerns over the timeliness of case progression. There's been an increase in the number of cases dropped by the CPS, leaving many victims and witnesses in complete despair and feeling let down. Mrs. Main, the government needs to decide what its vision for the criminal justice system is and what it wants a 21st century CPS to do. Its slash and burn approach to the CPS is putting justice at risk. Despite the CPS being a demand-led organisation that must obviously respond accordingly to the circumstances that it finds itself in, the government has removed vital resources and expertise. What goal, Mrs Main, is the government trying to achieve? If it's cuts for the sake of cuts without having had a proper review of the entire system to include legal aid, because, of course, criminal solicitors also provide a very vital service within the criminal justice system, then I fear the CPS is heading for further and more major difficulties. What we've heard today is that the CPS is struggling to cope with demand, the increased demand and prosecutions, whether in-house or whether at the independent bar. Prosecutors are being expected to achieve the unachievable. The combination of massive budget cuts and large increases in complex cases has created the perfect storm in which cases are not being dealt with effectively. I'd invite the attorney, through the solicitor, to set out what steps his office will take to remedy this very worrying problem. Can the solicitor say today whether the Chancellor will provide the 50 million the Director of Public Prosecution has requested? What has the law officers done in terms of impact assessments on the CPS? What inquiries and investigations or discussions even has the solicitor and the attorney had with the director as to whether the service is coping? I think it's not coping at all well. And as I've said earlier, Mrs Main, that is the evidence of users of the service. And as my honourable and learned friend said, there must be a strategy beyond just taking the money out. It seems to me that there is no strategy, it's just cut. And regrettably, Mrs Main, I'm afraid the axe is falling on victims and witnesses. Thank you.
Minister.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mrs Main, and I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Lady, the member for Erith and Thamesmead, on securing this debate. I'm never clear when we have a division whether or not I'm given injury time, in the sense that I have an extra 15 minutes. If that is the case, be warned, I might have to use it all, because I want to make sure that I refer to the excellent contributions from members on all sides of this House. It's perhaps right of us to, and certainly right of me as one of Her Majesty's law officers, to remind the House why it is that the Crown Prosecution Service was set up some 30 years ago. It was set up to deliver justice for the public through the independent prosecution of crime across England and Wales. And I was very interested in the comments of the Honourable Member, the Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Angus, about the question of independence. It is very much at the heart of how the Criminal Justice Service in England and Wales operates. I think actually there are parallels between the work of employed prosecutors in Scotland and those employed by the Crown Prosecution Service in England. Whilst prosecutors remain within the employ of that service, then conflicts should not and cannot arise. But where we have an independent referral service, such as the Bar of England and Wales, then the independence and objectivity that they can bring to often difficult and sensitive cases is without parallel, in my opinion, in the Western world. And we should celebrate that, and celebrate as well the work done by Crown prosecutors, the length and breadth of England and Wales, and all the support staff who work so hard in offices and in courts up and down the country. And I can speak with 20 years of experience as a prosecutor who's worked very closely with the Crown Prosecution Service, particularly in Wales, dealing with a wide range of serious crime. And that experience was something that I not only cherish, but find incredibly useful in the work that I do as a law officer. And I am delighted to welcome new members, not just to this debate, but to this House, who have similar experience of the criminal justice system. We have two in the room today, the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Cheltenham, and my honourable friend, the member for Cheltenham, the Honourable Learned Gentleman, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, to whose excellent speech I will return. But it would be wrong of me not to refer as well to the Honourable Gentleman for Torfaen, who I think went down a more civil path in his career at the bar, reminded us of his early days, an experience that I think a number of us have shared. And the Honourable Lady Member for Neath as well, of course, is a qualified member of the bar too, and I think that should be put on the record, and I'm grateful to her for her contribution, albeit on an issue that is perhaps more within the purview of the Ministry of Justice with respect to her. How the delivery of justice is achieved is, of course, by working with other agencies. And it's perhaps the contribution of the Honourable Lady that brought that very much into perspective, because although the CPS is a very large cog in the system, it is but one part of that system. And it has to work with the police and with the court system in order to make sure that criminal cases are not only brought to court, but brought to a conclusion. And the test that is applied is one that, of course, those of us who are so close to it can probably recite in their sleep, but it is one that is nonetheless very, very important that we remind ourselves of it. The two-tier test, whether there is two-limb test, whether there is firstly a realistic prospect of a conviction, and secondly, whether it is in the public interest to bring the prosecution. And again, that perhaps somewhat, I hope, answers the criticism made by the Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Angus, about the bringing of cases by the CPS which have not ended up in a successful conviction and which, in his words, have brought into question the reputation of the service. Well, with respect to him, if the Crown Prosecution Service were to adopt a test about a risk of acquittal, then no cases would ever be brought, because there will always be a risk of an acquittal, always a risk of taking a case to court, and that should not deter Crown prosecutors from doing their job. And I'll give way to him.
And I entirely agree with what he was saying. I was merely making the point there have been some very high-profile cases in which convictions were not secured, and perhaps some where the evidence was shaky at best, and that has reflected in the public mind on the CPS. It's not a criticism of the CPS. I understand that not all cases are successful, not all cases shouldn't be successful.
Well, I'm sorry to disagree with the Honourable Gentleman, but therein lies the problem. If we start as politicians and commentators making value judgments like that, we undermine confidence in the independence of the prosecutorial system. We have to trust an impartial and objective application of the threshold test. Any question of that, I think, causes me and many others great concern about the integrity of our prosecutorial system. I think there was going to be an intervention from the Honourable Learned Member, and I'll take it.
Thank you very much. Just to agree with me that where a case is charged and the judge decides there's a case to answer, that is a case that's properly brought, even if there's an acquittal. And it's very important to our criminal justice system that we adhere to that. The mere fact that a case, whether high profile or otherwise, does not end in a conviction is not a test of whether the charging decision was right or wrong. A better test is whether the judge left it to the jury, and if that's the case, it normally means the case should have been brought.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. He presaged the point I was going to make about sufficiency and about the checks and balances we have throughout the court process, where arguments can be made at the beginning of a case about sufficiency of the evidence, at the end of the prosecution case, and indeed in some rare circumstances where judges withdraw cases from juries. It doesn't often happen at the end of defence cases, but that power remains. And I think that we are also in danger in making such criticism, in calling into question the jury process and indeed the whole system that is so integral to the rule of law, I think, in this country. And I was asked, and rhetorically perhaps, but I will give an answer as to the strategy that this government has. It is a criminal justice system that upholds the rule of law and that enhances public confidence in the system, and also make sure that there is a consistent approach when it comes to the bringing of cases and the sentencing of cases, to ensure that the public not only feel confident but also are protected as a result of the due process within that system. That's nothing new. That is something that has been with us for generations now, but it is something that this government believes in as passionately as previous governments of whatever colour. Now, I wanted to move on to deal with each contribution in turn, and in particular, deal with the speech, the opening speech by the Honourable Lady, the member for Erith and Thamesmead, and her own experience having given evidence in a trial. And I have to say, it doesn't sound to me like best practice was followed in her case. And I'm glad that she's brought it to the attention of this House, because those with responsibility for the administration of justice, not only in the Magistrates' Court of Bexley but elsewhere, will do well to remember that the housing of witnesses for the prosecution with either defendants or their families is wholly inappropriate and leads to all sorts of complications that I needn't recite here. She asked specific questions about witness care officers. I accept that the numbers have been reduced in line with other staff reductions, but importantly, those reductions have been accompanied by reforms to better target the limited resources we have in order to help those witnesses who are intimidated, who are vulnerable, and those in greatest need. And there is even more that is being done with regard to the change of culture that was referred to by my honourable friend, the member for Cheltenham. For example, the government is now improving access to information for victims through the new online and telephone-based victim information service that was launched back in March of this year. And I believe that the increasing commissioning of victim services through local police and crime commissioners will create a more responsive service, a more localised service, if you like, that I don't believe will create a postcode lottery, but will emphasise best practice from which other areas can learn. So whilst I accept that there, of course, have been reductions in expenditure, the change in culture that everybody within the system, whether it be counsel, solicitors, in fact, the role that I think lawyers have in explaining and reassuring and supporting witnesses and victims is one that that continues to grow. Of course, there are always... I'll give way.
On precisely that point, isn't it right that where counsel applying the Victims' Charter goes to speak to witnesses as they come to court, to explain the situation, speak to victims as well, that can have such an extraordinary impact on how they end up viewing the criminal justice system, and that doesn't cost a penny.
Very much so, and I think a lot of us who pioneered that sort of work back in the 90s find now that a lot of what we said and believed in then is becoming standard practice, and that is absolutely right. We've heard reference to the victim's right to review, and indeed, as has been made clear in an intervention upon the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Rochdale, there's an ongoing process in relation to a particular case that means it will be wholly inappropriate for me to comment about that. But I hear what the Honourable Gentleman says, and I'll come back to his points about historic child sexual exploitation in a moment. The importance in having a new victim right to review scheme that was established last year is that it gives victims a further opportunity to question and to ask the Crown Prosecution Service to, with the help of independent advice, consider again the merits of particular decisions. And it's right to say that so far, between June of 2013 and the end of September of last year, 263 decisions were overturned by the new system. It's right to say that it is a very small proportion of the number of Crown prosecution decisions that are made, but it is an extra safety valve that I think goes a long way to, as I said in relation to our strategy, enhance public confidence in the criminal justice system. I've already referred en passant to the Honourable Gentleman Member for Rochdale, and he talked with his usual power about child sexual exploitation. It is a national emergency. I entirely agree with him, and so does the government. And the way in which complainants were dealt with historically in towns such as Rotherham and the town that he represents was wrong. There was far too much of an emphasis upon the reliability of the individual, often very young and vulnerable witness, and rather than an overall view of the merits of the case. That has been quite rightly acknowledged to have been an incorrect approach. And I think that the thrust of the work that is being carried out by the Crown Prosecution Service now very much reflects the fact that those lessons have clearly been learned, and that there are a number of marked successes when it comes to convictions in cases of that nature. A number of so-called celebrities who quite rightly have been brought to justice, and of course a number of larger conspiracy-based cases involving many, many young and vulnerable complainants and young victims who now have had their voice heard, as he quite rightly says, and who now can see that some justice has been brought in order to help them get on with the lives that have been torn asunder by the abuse that they suffered. I wanted to dwell somewhat on the contributions of the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Torvine, who quite rightly talked about a question of pressure and efficiency, and where there is a reduction in the number of lawyers, how decisions are to be made. And I think the way that we measure that is by looking at some of the efficiency measurements that the CPS has, of course, conducted. And looking, first of all, at the percentage of guilty pleas at first hearing. That's a very good measurement, Mrs. Main, because that clearly demonstrates that there's been an excellent level of pre-trial and pre-plea preparation in terms of case management, which means that the evidence has been presented clearly in a way that those advising defendants can confidently tender advice in a proper way. The percentage of guilty pleas at first hearing has increased from 63.4% in 2010-11 to 70.6% in the last financial year. That's a significant increase. Another vital piece of information relates to the percentage of magistrates' court proceedings that are dropped at a third or even fourth or fifth hearing. That percentage has fallen from 44.2 to 34.1%. And in the Crown Court, cracked and ineffective trials due to prosecution failure has fallen in percentage terms from 18.2% to 13.5%. It shows to me, Mrs. Main, that those who are responsible for decision-making and case preparation within the CPS are rising to the challenge and are actually yielding very significant results. And I pay tribute to Chief Crown Prosecutors in regions such as the West Midlands and now in the South West for understanding the importance of the management of the huge volume of cases that come across the desks of prosecutors week in, week out, and making sure that further improvements are made so that from the CPS's point of view, they are doing everything they can to make sure that the court service is efficient. Now, moving on to the contribution from the Honourable and Learned Gentleman, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, it would be churlish of me not to put on the record my grateful thanks, Mrs. Dorries, for his service as Director of Public Prosecutions. He came in at a time when the service already knew that it was going to be facing some important financial challenges, and under his stewardship, he managed them admirably. And it's in no small part due to the leadership that he showed that the sort of figures that I'm able to bring to this debate today and the improved efficiencies that we see within the CPS have been achieved. And we're grateful to him. He asked about strategy, and I hope that I've given him the answer that I think needs to be set out. But he also talked about the question of lines of sight as to the risks being run with regard to the impact of reduced resources at a time when it is clear that caseloads are increasing. And I agree with him. Caseloads clearly are increasing. We have more terrorism cases. We have an increase in child sexual exploitation cases. And he's right to ask these questions. Well, I can reassure him that, as in his day, there continue to be regular meetings between the Director of Public Prosecutions and Chief Crown Prosecutors to ensure that, that the current Director is aware fully of the impact of changes in caseload and resources on individual CPS areas. And further than that, of course, both the Attorney and I regularly meet the Director and the Chief Executive of the CPS, Peter Lewis, to discuss a range of measures which crucially includes resources and the caseload mix coming into the CPS. And I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
The solicitor for giving way. I wonder in those discussions that he's had with the Director of Public Prosecutions that she has mentioned to him, and indeed to the Attorney, that they need 50 million now, very urgently, in order to properly prosecute historic sex cases, and what representations is he made to the Chancellor on that?
Well, I'm grateful to him, and I wanted to come to the question of finance because I can reassure him that the CPS continues to discuss actively with the Treasury the particular requirements and the resourcing pressures that it faces. So the idea that somehow there is a sort of nonchalant sit-back approach to this would be wholly wrong, and I hope that that reassures him that not only are the pressures understood, but that at the highest levels of government, discussions continue with regard to making sure... Well, look, I can reassure him. For he speaks from a sedentary position. I can reassure him that when it comes to the prosecution of serious crime, whether it be terrorism, whether it be child sexual exploitation, the question of resources doesn't come into it. Does not come into it. What comes into it is a question of the threshold test that I referred to at the beginning of my speech. Now, the CPS continues to look at the impact of resource changes and, as I've said, is working with colleagues in the Treasury as part of the ongoing spending review. Now, it wouldn't be appropriate of me to start to prejudge what the outcome of that will be. But the debate is timely, and I accept that members are impatient, but that is where we are with regard to the ongoing pressures and the risks that the Honourable and Learned Gentleman talked about. I think my honourable friend wanted to intervene.
This issue of resources, isn't it right to say that... Thank you. Isn't it right to say that where there is a specific need, the government will step in? And there's no clearer example than that. But when the SFO had to consider whether it had sufficient resources to go after so-called LIBOR fraudsters, that the money was found for those detailed and complex investigations. Where there's a need, it is delivered.
I think my honourable friend was talking about blockbuster funding when it comes to the SFO. Now, I think it would be invidious for me to make direct comparisons, but I'll simply say this. It's a point very well made indeed. Can I deal with the question of finance and to, I hope, demolish the rather attractive but somewhat false position or characterisation, colourful, I would say, characterisation that the Honourable Gentleman gave to the approach that the government has taken with regard to the CPS budget. I think he described it as a hope for the best approach. I'm sorry to disappoint him, but that is not a position that is either accurate or fair with respect to the CPS. As I've already said, under the stewardship of the Honourable and Learned Gentleman, the member for Holborn, preparations were made before the spending review of 2010 for the CPS to start reducing its costs. For example, by releasing resources away from the back office at HQ to the front line, by renegotiating important IT contracts and in order to achieve significant savings, by introducing a new IT equipment and workstation ratio strategy, by looking at the closure of uneconomic smaller offices. All this began at a stage prior to the spending review. And, of course, since the spending review, those policies have been taken further. We've seen the consolidation of operations into regional hubs and the ending of occupying unnecessary buildings. And we've also seen the reduction in the number of CPS geographical areas from 42 to 13, together with a reduction in management numbers. In fact, it is back office functions, Mrs. Dorries, that have taken the greatest cut. You have 50% reduction of HQ staff, 20% savings from the renegotiation of the IT and communications contracts, and a reduction in the estate from 95 offices back in 2010 to 40 this year. And that's not hope for the best. That's not back of a cigarette packet stuff with respect to the Honourable Gentleman. That's a carefully calibrated and planned, structured change. Again, largely authored and led by the Honourable Gentleman. And that's what continues to happen. There is, as I've said, no question that when it comes to the prosecution of offences, that somehow negotiations with the Treasury will impact upon individual decision-making. The independence of the Crown Prosecution Service is a self-evident truth. And in order to reinforce that, perhaps it's right of me just to look at the overall results that we see within the service. The CPS now achieves a conviction rate in the magistrates' courts of 83.5%, which is an increase from 80.6% back in 2004-2005. And similarly, in the Crown Court, the conviction rate is now 79.4%, which is up from just over 75% 10 years ago. And as I've already said, guilty plea rates continue to rise in both the Crown Court and the Magistrates' Court. I'm particularly struck, Mr. Dorries, by the rise in the number, both the volume and the proportion of cases involving violence against women and girls. In the last year, we have seen the highest ever volume and proportion of cases. It's now reached 88,359 in number, which is a rise of over 11, nearly 12,000 from the previous financial year. And that's marked as well by the successful number of defendants who have been dealt with and prosecuted to completion in the last year. We saw over 107,000 defendants in cases involving violence against women and girls being prosecuted, the highest ever number. And convictions again rose. The numbers convicted have risen from 67,380 in the last financial year to 78,773 this year. These are the highest levels area. These are, I think, far more eloquent testimony to the success and the continued work of the Crown Prosecution Service than anything I can summon up. And with that, I commend its work to the House and thank once again the Honourable Lady for giving me the opportunity to address those issues.
Questions that this House has considered the work of the Crown Prosecution Service. As many of that opinion say aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Or do we say yes? Ayes have it. Order, order. There were no ayes. Is everybody here for the next debate?